The seating plan at Wexford Hall, on the evening of the 4th of December in the year 1813, had been signed in the Duke's own hand. He had drawn the line himself, beside the name of Miss Catherine Brooks, that placed her at the servants' table beneath the gallery. He had done it, by every appearance, to humble her, to seat the music teacher who had come from Bath, where the county could see the distance between her seat and his. The footman carried the soup in at 6:30. The county watched. The Duke set down his spoon, rose from the head of the table, walked the length of the room past 24 silent faces, and sat down beside her. The silence in the dining room held a moment longer than the candles flickered. The smell of warm soup hung over the cloth. The under-butler, Mr. Hodge, who had been raising his spoon, set it down again. Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, turned the smallest fraction of an inch toward the Duke, and then composed her face. At the head of the table, Lady Margaret Sefton lifted her glass and held it half suspended, as a woman holds a glass when she has decided not to drink. The Reverend Pellow, 3 seats from where the Duke had been, swallowed audibly, his throat dry. Lord Vance, who had ridden up from Lincoln that afternoon on the pretext of a bill in committee, set his hand flat on the cloth. The fingers were still. Lady Anne Strickland, who had travelled from Strickland Park to be seen as the Duke's guest, lifted her chin 1 degree and let the breath out through her nose. The Duke of Wexford did not speak to the room. He turned his head to Mrs. Briggs first, as he had been taught at 12 years old to turn his head first to the woman who had run his father's house for 30 years. He said, very quiet, that he hoped he did not disturb her supper. Mrs. Briggs answered, equally low, that he did not, Your Grace. He turned then to Mr. Hodge and asked, with a politeness that the under-butler had not received from a master in 26 years at Wexford Hall, whether his place might be set. Mr. Hodge said it could. He looked, finally, at Miss Catherine Brooks. He said, in the same quiet voice he had used to the housekeeper, Miss Brooks, may I? And she, who had not flinched when she read her place card at the foot of the room, did not flinch now. She inclined her head 1/2 inch, exactly the inclination she had used at the long gallery the morning before, when he had walked in upon her studying her father's miniature. And she said, Your Grace? A footman, who had been frozen against the sideboard for 1/2 minute, moved at last. A chair was set, its legs whispering on the polished oak. The Duke sat down beside Miss Brooks at the servants' table. He took up the warm pewter spoon that had been laid for him there, and he began his soup. It would be 3 days before any London paper named what had happened at Wexford Hall that night. It would be a week before the matter reached the Dowager Marchioness of Strickland in Berkeley Square, who set down the paper and said only, Oh dear. But on the night itself, Mrs. Briggs, the housekeeper, who had carried Wexford bread to 2 generations of duchesses, leaned a 1/4 inch toward the Duke and said, Will Your Grace take a roll? And the Duke said, If you would be so kind. And Catherine Brooks ate her soup with a steady hand, and did not look at the high table or at her own plate, but at the candlelight on the polished wood between her bread and her glass. The candles guttered. The fire in the great hearth gave a half-hearted crack. The smell of warm roast drifted along the cloth. The Duke spoke quietly to Mr. Hodge of the under-coachman's father's gout. Mrs. Briggs, with the long professional discipline of her office, spoke quietly to Catherine of the seminary at Bath where she taught. Lord Vance, at the head of the room, attempted twice to begin a conversation about Parliament with Lady Margaret, who responded each time too late and too short to allow the topic to carry. Lady Anne Strickland did not speak. The fish was carried in. It was eaten. The roast was carried in. It was eaten. By 9:30, the Duke had risen, bowed to Mrs. Briggs and to Miss Brooks, said his good nights to the table at large, and gone alone to the long library at the east end of the house. His own hand was cold on the brass door latch. The footman, who carried the brandy decanter to the library at 10:15, reported, 12 hours later, to Mrs. Briggs in her sitting room, that his Grace had been seated by the fire with his coat off and his neckcloth loosened, and had said only, "Thank you, Stephen. Set it there." The footman had set it there. The fire had burned down to its red coals. The Duke had not poured. He had been thinking, since he sat down at the servants' table, of his father. The late Duke of Wexford had been lost to them on the 28th of July, of a quiet complaint of the heart that Dr. Marston had given 2 months' notice on. He had lived 3 months past the prediction, by the force of his own desire to see a particular bill out of committee in the upper house. He had not lived to see it. The new Duke, Alexander James Sefton, called Alex by the 3 living men in England who were entitled to call him so, had spent the August through October of 1813 on the steward's books at Wexford and the political accounts at Westminster. He had been, in the considered judgment of his man of business, Mr. Henry Holroyd, a man very near the point at which a body must either weep or break. The loss of a father had not broken him. The loss of a father in the middle of the only piece of legislation the father had ever cared about had nearly bled. By the end of October, his eyes shadowed and his hand cold on the brass inkstand. He had eaten 3 meals on 3 consecutive days at Mr. Holroyd's insistence. By the 2nd week of November, he had begun, at last, to sleep. The Dowager, for so Lady Margaret was titled by the household, though not in strict law, being the late Duke's sister rather than his widow, had arrived from her dower house in the East Riding on the 1st of November. She had taken charge of Wexford Hall, as she had taken charge of any room she entered for 30 years. She had reviewed the Christmas calendar. She had written invitations. She had revised the seating plans. By the 3rd week of November, she had informed the Duke at breakfast that Lady Anne Strickland of Strickland Park would be the new mistress of Wexford Hall before Lady Day, and that he would be writing privately to her father within the fortnight. He had set down his warm coffee, looked at his aunt with quiet eyes, and said, very quietly, that he would consider the matter. She had taken this for assent. It was not assent. He had not yet known what it was. He had been thinking that his father, who had once wept in his study after being publicly cut by the king at Carlton House, had pressed a snuff-box into his son's hand the next morning and said, "Alexander, a Sefton may grieve, but not in any room where another man may see him grieve." The boy had been 12. He had believed his father, completely. He had carried the snuff-box in his coat pocket from that day forward. He carried it now. He had reached for it tonight at the servants' table, between the soup and the fish, and his thumb had brushed the worn silver edge of the lid, as it had brushed it 8,000 times in 19 years. He had not opened it. The silver was cold under his fingers. He had risen quietly. He had walked. Now in the library, alone, the brandy untouched at his elbow, he turned his head quietly to the box on the writing desk. It was a black japanned box his father had kept on the corner of his own desk for as long as Alexander could remember, and that, after the funeral, had been moved without discussion to the new Duke's desk. It contained, the steward Mr. Holroyd had once said, "Your father's important letters, Your Grace, those he did not give to me to file." The Duke had not opened the box. He had been waiting, he supposed, for the right hour. The hour was now. He lifted the lid. He sorted slowly through the contents. Bills of mortality for 2 old servants the late Duke had pensioned. A folded list in his father's hand of names that meant nothing to him. A letter from his mother, dated 1798, that he could not yet read. A sealed packet, labelled, in his father's careful, round hand, "Brooks, for my son, when needful." He unsealed it. It contained 4 letters from Dr. Edward Brooks, of Bath, to the late Duke of Wexford, dated between 1809 and 1812. The paper warm now from the library fire, the ink faded to soft brown. The letters were on the question of a fever the late Duke had taken at the Spring Assize at Lancaster in March of 1809, of the medical regimen Dr. Brooks had set him on, and of the private kindness of attending him in person at Wexford Hall for the 8 days during which his life was held in question. They mentioned, in passing, a daughter then 16 years of age, named Catherine, in her last year at Mrs. Linfield's seminary at Bath. They spoke of her mother's loss 18 months earlier, and of the doctor's hope that his daughter, who had a turn for music and a steady hand, would in due course have the means to make her own way. The Duke read the letters twice. He set them in their packet, and he set the packet beside the brandy. Then he opened the snuff box at last, after 19 years, and took a pinch, as his father had taught him to take it. And he did not weep. But it was a near thing. It had begun, the Duke would later be told by Mr. Holroyd, with a letter from Bath dated the 11th of November. The letter was from Mr. Robert Anstruther, an attorney in Bath, who acted for the estate of the late Dr. Brooks, Edward Brooks. It had been addressed to the late Duke of Wexford at Wexford Hall, by an oversight that meant the writer did not yet know the late Duke had been lost in July. Mrs. Briggs had given it to Mr. Holroyd, who had taken it to the new Duke in the library on the 12th, and the Duke had opened it and read it on the spot. Mr. Anstruther wrote, with the formality of his profession, that Dr. Brooks had left a small bequest to his daughter, Miss Catherine. It was contingent upon certain assurances given by the late Duke at the doctor's deathbed in November of 1812. The daughter, having attained her 24th year and being employed as music mistress at Mrs. Linfield's seminary, was unaware of them. Her uncle and guardian, Mr. Joseph Hayward, an attorney at York, had instructed Mr. Anstruther to apply to Wexford Hall to clarify the late Duke's intentions, that the question might be at last settled. The Duke set the warm letter on his hand, his fingers steady on the paper. Mr. Anstruther had ventured that, if His Grace would receive Miss Brooks for a half-hour, the matter might be discharged in a single afternoon. The Duke had written by return to Mr. Anstruther at Bath that he would receive Miss Brooks at Wexford Hall at her own convenience, and would account it a personal courtesy if she could be persuaded to come in person. The letter from Bath had reached Mrs. Linfield's seminary on the 17th. Miss Brooks had been called in from the music room, her fingers still cold from the keys. The headmistress, a sensible woman with no patience for nonsense, gave her a fortnight's leave, and paid her quarterly salary in coin from the writing desk. "You will want money in your purse if you are going into a duke's house, my dear, even if you sleep at the inn." She had thanked her, packed 2 black gowns and 1 half-mourning lavender, and taken the Morning Post on the 20th to Bristol. There she spent 2 days at her uncle's parlour fire, reviewing such of her father's papers as Mr. Anstruther had thought she should see. The ink faded to soft brown on warm paper. On the 23rd, she took the post-chaise to Wexford, the wind sharp off the open road, and the smell of wet leather rising from her cloak. She had arrived in Wexford village at 5 in the afternoon on the 24th of November. She had taken a small room at the Boar's Head Inn, the better of the villages too, and had sent up to Wexford Hall a card, written in a hand her mother had been pleased to call schoolroom neat. Miss Catherine Brooks presents her compliments to His Grace the Duke of Wexford, and would be obliged if he would name an hour at which she might wait upon him concerning her late father's bequest. Mrs. Briggs received the card at the servants' door at 6:30. She read it twice. She had been present in Wexford Hall in November of 1812, when Dr. Edward Brooks had attended the late Duke through the 8 days of the second fever, fatal at the end. She remembered Dr. Brooks's quiet voice at the foot of the late Duke's bed. She had not known the doctor had a daughter. She had not known the daughter was, by the date on the card, 24 years old. She carried the card herself to the new Duke in the library. He named 10 o'clock the next morning. At 10 o'clock the next morning, the 25th of November, a Thursday, Miss Brooks had walked from the inn up the avenue to Wexford Hall in a lavender pelisse cut for her by her aunt at York, and a black bonnet with a single grey ribbon. The avenue was cold. Her boots crunched on gravel still hard with frost. The wind smelled faintly of wood smoke from the lodge chimney. She had been shown into a small anteroom off the great hall. A quarter of an hour later, Mrs. Briggs had taken her into the long library, where the Duke of Wexford was standing at the writing desk with Mr. Holroyd. The room was warm, smelling of leather bindings, old paper, and a coal fire newly lit. He had stood when she came in. He had remained standing, as a man should, until she was seated. He had introduced Mr. Holroyd. He had said, with a politeness she had not been prepared for from a duke, that he was glad she had come, that he hoped her journey had been easy, and that he intended to honour his father's word in every particular. It was at the third sentence of this speech, with her eyes on the polished oak of the library floor where the morning sun was striking the boards under the long windows, that Miss Catherine Brooks understood that the Duke meant to make her, by the lights of her father's standing and his father's promises, a not inconsiderable woman. She had drawn one breath through her nose and out, and had said, with a steadiness that surprised even her, "Your Grace, I beg you will tell me what my father asked of yours, before any other thing." The Duke had paused softly. He had then, with Mr. Holroyd looking on, told her. "Doctor," Edward Brooks had asked of the late Duke of Wexford, in the November of 1812, two things. First, that the doctor's small Bath property, worth perhaps £1,800, be conveyed in trust for the doctor's daughter, with the Duke as trustee, and the income, perhaps £80 a year, paid to her on her 25th birthday. The papers were ready for her hand at the Bath attorney's office. Second, that the daughter, who had been at school in Bath and had taken a steady turn for music, be permitted to apply to the Duke, as her father's friend, for such advice or assistance as a young woman without family might reasonably want of him. The late Duke had agreed. He had pressed the doctor's hand, warm leather of a riding glove on cold fingers, by the fire in the small room at Bath. The doctor had been lost at midnight on the 7th of November, 1812, with the Duke beside him. Miss Catherine Brooks had been told only that her father had passed at midnight on the 7th of November. She had not been told of either of these conditions. Her hands, in her lap, were cold. She had thought, until this morning in the long library at Wexford Hall, that her father had left her £70 and the goodwill of his old friends. She had also thought, though she had told no one, that the Duke, who had been her father's friend, would in due course forget her name. The smell of beeswax and old leather hung warm in the room. The fire whispered low in the grate. She said, very slowly, "Your Grace, I am most grateful." Her throat was dry. She added, with the care she had used as a girl in her first French lesson, "I had not come to ask anything of you. I have come, sir, because Mr. Anstruther of Bath advised me that the late Duke had given a promise, and that the promise was not yet concluded. I should be very sorry if it were thought that I had applied." The Duke had inclined his head softly the depth she had inclined hers at the door. He had said, "Miss Brooks, it has not been thought." She had then asked one further question. She had asked, in a voice she would later regret as the voice of an unschooled woman, what manner of man her father had been in his last days, and whether he had spoken at the end. The Duke of Wexford had looked at her, had paused 2 seconds longer than her own father would have paused, and had said, "He spoke of you, Miss Brooks. He spoke of you softly." Miss Catherine Brooks had set her hand on the arm of the chair, and had thanked His Grace for receiving her, and she had risen, and Mrs. Briggs had been at the door, and she had walked out of the library and down the avenue to the inn in the cold November sun, and had wept for 1/2 hour in the small bare room at the inn before she had washed her face and gone down to dinner. It was Lady Margaret Sefton, the Dowager, who had heard of the meeting from Mrs. Briggs at 3 in the afternoon of the same day, and who had set in motion, before the candles were lit, the events of the 4th of December. She had not believed a word of it. She had not believed that a doctor of Bath, who had attended her brother 8 days at his country seat and pocketed his 300 guineas, had asked nothing more than a piece of Bath rent for his daughter. She had not believed that her brother had not promised more. She had not believed that a young woman of 24, in a lavender pelisse, with the dust of the Morning Post still on her hem, had come to Wexford on the modest errand the attorney's letter described. The Dowager Lady Margaret had spent 30 years in the warm, candle-lit inner rooms of the great houses of the Riding, and she could tell, she would have said, an applicant from a daughter at 20 paces, in any light. Miss Catherine Brooks was, by Lady Margaret's lights, an applicant. She had gone, that same afternoon, to her nephew the new Duke in the library, where he had been alone since Mr. Holroyd had left at noon. She had sat down opposite him in the chair Miss Brooks had risen from at 11, and had folded her gloved hands in her lap, and had said, "Alexander, we must speak." The Duke had set down his pen. Lady Margaret had said 3 things, in 3 sentences, in the order she had rehearsed coming down the stair. First, the Brooks bequest must be concluded with all decent speed, and Miss Brooks must be paid her annuity and dismissed, lest the village take ideas. Second, the daughter's request, for so the Dowager had decided in the carriage from the Dower House, to call any further conversation between the Duke and Miss Brooks, must be heard once, in the presence of witnesses, and refused on grounds the Dowager would herself supply. Third, the Dowager had taken the liberty of inviting Miss Brooks to the Saturday dinner on the 4th of December, to which Lord Vance, Lady Anne Strickland, the Marquess, and 7 other respectable persons had already been invited, so that the matter might be heard and concluded in the only company the Dowager would admit to be present at its conclusion, the county. The Duke had stared at his aunt for 10 seconds together, without speaking. He had said, at last, "Aunt." "Alexander?" "You have invited Miss Brooks to the Saturday dinner." "I have." "With Lord Vance present?" "With Lady Anne Strickland present." He had risen. He had walked to the window. He had stood looking down the avenue toward the village of Wexford, where Miss Catherine Brooks was, at that moment, in the small bare room at the Boar's Head, washing her face with cold water from a basin she had broken her finger upon that morning. He had turned. He had said, "Aunt, you will not humiliate her." The Dowager had said quietly, "Alexander, I have not the slightest intention of humiliating her. I intend that she shall be sat where her station places her, paid what your father promised, sign the papers Mr. Holroyd will set in front of her, wished a safe journey, and go." The Dowager had paused, softly. She had added, with the precision she had used in 1796 with the King's First Minister, "I intend further, my dear, that you shall conduct yourself as your father would, with grace and at a distance. That no person leaving this house on the morning of the 5th of December shall be in any doubt of your engagement to Lady Anne." The Duke had not yet been engaged to Lady Anne. He had told his aunt this. The Dowager had said only, "Alexander, you have been engaged to her for 3 weeks. You have not yet written." It was at this point that the Duke had said, and Mr. Holroyd, returning at 4 o'clock for his book and pausing at the door, had heard him say, "Aunt, I will make the seating plan myself." The Dowager had inclined her head 1/4 inch, and had said, "By all means, Alexander." She had risen. She had left the library. The Duke had not sat down for an hour. He had made the seating plan that night. The fire in his study had burned low, and the smell of cold ink hung over the writing table. He had set Miss Catherine Brooks at the servants' table, because he could not see, by any calculation he could make in the small hours of the 26th of November, a way to set her anywhere else that would not mortify her on her first formal evening in a country house in 19 years. He had set her between Mrs. Briggs and Mr. Hodge, the 2 persons in his household who would be kindest to her, because he could not bear to set her between strangers. He had told himself, several times, that it was a kindness. He had also told himself, several times, that it was a cowardice. His fingers were cold on the seal. He had told himself, in the end, that he was a Sefton, and that a Sefton makes the choice that secures the larger ground. He had been wrong. He would understand by 6:30 on the evening of the 4th of December that he had been wrong. He would understand it again 2 days later, when Mrs. Briggs would knock softly at the library door and say, "Your Grace, there is a letter from his lordship Lord Vance, and a card from Lady Strickland." But on the night of the seating plan, he had thought he was making the best choice available to a man of his station. He had been a man of his station for 128 days. He would not be one for very much longer. On the morning of Friday the 3rd of December, the day before the dinner, Miss Catherine Brooks had walked from the Boar's Head to Wexford Hall a second time, her hands cold in her muff, her breath white in the still air. She had been sent for, at her own request, to view a particular item in the long gallery, a miniature portrait of her father, Dr. Edward Brooks, which the late Duke had commissioned from a Bath miniaturist in the spring of 1810. The Duke had not been at the hall. He had been at Pickering, on the steward's business with a tenant. Mrs. Briggs had given the necessary directions to a footman, and had sent up to the Duke at Pickering a note, by a boy on a horse, the boy's pony breathing hot in the cold lane, that Miss Brooks would be at the hall at 11, and that the housekeeper had thought it proper to inform His Grace of her coming. The Duke had read the note at 10:30. He had written back. He had been 5 minutes too late to be in the hall when Miss Brooks was shown in. He had been 3 minutes too early to be in the long gallery when she rose, having paid her quiet respects to the small painted face of her father, set in its case on the third shelf of the third cabinet, and had turned to leave. He had walked into the long gallery from the south door. She had turned from the cabinet. They had met in the middle of the room, between the long window and the cold marble of the Sefton coat of arms. She had inclined her head 1/2 inch. She had said, "Your Grace." He had inclined his 1/2 inch. He had said, "Miss Brooks." He had not spoken for 2 seconds. He had been looking. He was honest enough with himself, even then, to know this, at the unspeakable quietness with which she had set her gloved hands one upon the other in front of her, at the angle of the chin he had remembered from yesterday morning, at the small ribbon of grey on the black bonnet, and the steadiness of her grey eyes that had no particular wish to look at him at all. He had said, "You have seen the portrait?" She had said, "I have, Your Grace. I thank you." He had said, "It is a good likeness." She had said, "It is, Your Grace. I had not seen one of him for 12 years. He had said, 12. She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Mrs. Briggs tells me you will leave us on Monday." She had said, "I shall, Your Grace, with your permission. The papers will be sent on to my uncle at York for completion." He had said, and at this point, Mrs. Briggs, who was at the gallery's far door and could not have helped overhearing, would later report to her sister in Lincoln that His Grace spoke before he thought, Mary, and I have never known him to do so. "Miss Brooks, my aunt has asked you to dine here on Saturday evening." Miss Brooks had said, very softly, "She has, Your Grace. I had thought to write my reply this afternoon." He had said, "Will you come?" She had said, "If it pleases Your Grace, I shall come." He had said, "It pleases me." She had inclined her head a third time. She had said, "Then I shall come, Your Grace." She had paused softly. She had said, with the same low formality her mother had taught her at the age of 9, "I should not wish, however, to put your household to inconvenience. Mrs. Briggs tells me there will be a marquis at the table." He had said, "There will." She had said, "Then I shall be content, Your Grace, to be placed where I am of least inconvenience." She had not, in saying this, meant the servants' table. She had meant a corner of the high table where she would draw no attention. The Duke had heard it, however, as it would have suited him to hear it, as a man under pressure hears most things. He had said, "You shall be placed where it gives me satisfaction to see you, Miss Brooks." She had said, "Your Grace." He had bowed her out of the long gallery. He had stood for some minutes at the south window looking down the avenue after she had gone. He had thought of his father. In the small, bare room at the Boar's Head, Miss Catherine Brooks had set her bonnet on the bed, washed her hands in cold water from the chipped jug, and taken from her writing case her father's last letter, which she carried with her always, and read it through twice. She had taken up her pen. She had written to her aunt at York that she had been received with kindness, and to her uncle that the papers were prepared and she would be back at York by the Wednesday. She had not written that she had liked the Duke. She had not yet known how to write that down. She had written instead that she had liked his manner with Mrs. Briggs. She had sealed both letters with a drop of warm wax and gone down to dinner. She had not slept easily. She had been thinking of the look in the Duke of Wexford's eyes when he had said, "He spoke of you, Miss Brooks. He spoke of you softly." She had thought of her father's hand on her hair when she was 9, and of his cough at the end of the spring of 1812. She had thought of the seating plan, and of being placed, as she had asked, somewhere of small consequence. She had wondered whether she was equal to it. She had thought she was. She would be, on the night of the 4th of December, more nearly equal to it than the Duke of Wexford, or the Dowager Lady Margaret Sefton, or Lord Vance of Lincoln, or Lady Anne Strickland of Strickland Park had any reason to suppose. But she would not have predicted that the Duke would rise. He would. The Saturday dinner had been called for 6:30. The carriage road from Strickland Park to Wexford Hall was 11 miles and had been salted by the Dowager's order. The carriages began arriving at 6. The Reverend Pellow walked up from the village rectory, having dined lightly on a cup of broth, and arrived at 15:15. Miss Catherine Brooks, in her one black silk evening dress that had been her mother's, softly remade by her aunt for her wear at the seminary's annual prize-giving, walked the avenue alone in a borrowed cloak of the innkeeper's wife. The cold December wind was sharp on her face. The warm smell of wood smoke drifted from the village chimneys. She was shown into the great hall at 6:25. Mrs. Briggs took her cloak. The Dowager, in the small drawing-room with Lady Anne, did not come out. The Duke came out. He had been in the small drawing-room with his aunt and Lady Anne and the Marquis of Strickland for 15 minutes, and had not exchanged 6 sentences with any of them. He had been told by Mrs. Briggs that Miss Brooks had arrived. He had walked the length of the great hall to greet her. He had bowed. He had said, "Miss Brooks, I am very glad you have come." She had inclined her head 1/2 inch. She had said, "Your Grace." He had then said, and Mrs. Briggs, who was 3 feet from his elbow, with the cloak still folded over her arm, would later remember this, "I hope you will tell me at supper of the Bath School, Miss Brooks. I have not had occasion, since I came down from Oxford, to ask anyone what is being taught in such a place." She had said, "Your Grace, I shall be pleased to tell you, if there is opportunity." He had said, "There shall be." He had bowed her into the great hall. He had turned back to the small drawing-room. He had thought, and this was the moment of the cowardice, and he would later be able to point to it, that he had said, "There shall be," and that he had meant it. The seating plan he had signed 2 nights ago had set her at the servants' table beneath the gallery. The calculation he had made about kindness and protection, and the lesser of 2 scrutinies would, when his guests filed through the door at 6:30, look like nothing more or less than what it was: the deliberate placing of a young woman of her station at the foot of his room, because his aunt had not approved of her at the head. The warm smell of beeswax was on the panelled wood. He had stood for a moment in the small drawing-room doorway. The Marquis of Strickland had been telling a story about a partridge. He had not interrupted the story. He had not yet known what he would do. He had walked to his place at the head of the table when the bell rang at 6:30. He had said grace. He had watched as Miss Catherine Brooks walked the length of the dining room past the assembled county, and read her place card at the foot of the table, and took her seat between Mrs. Briggs and Mr. Hodge, without the smallest alteration in her bearing. He had watched the footman carry the soup in. He had taken up his spoon. He had set it down. He had looked quietly, the length of the polished oak, to where Miss Catherine Brooks had set her hands one upon the other on her lap. He had thought of his father's voice, the voice that had said when he was 12, "A Sefton may grieve, but not in any room where another man may see him grieve." And he had thought that voice had been wrong, then and now, and that he had carried the wrong of it for 19 years in his coat pocket, along with the snuff-box his father had pressed into his hand. He had risen quietly. He had walked. The county had watched. The Dowager had set down her glass. Lord Vance had laid his hand flat on the cloth. Lady Anne Strickland had lifted her chin 1 degree. Miss Catherine Brooks had not flinched. The Duke of Wexford had sat down beside her at the servants' table on the evening of the 4th of December, 1813, and his neighbour at the high table, Lord Vance of Lincoln, had remarked afterward to Lady Margaret in the small drawing-room over the warm teacups that His Grace appeared to have lost his reason. The Dowager had said softly, with the smallest of smiles she had used in 1796 to dismiss the Bishop of London, "Lord Vance, I shall arrange for him to recover it." She would arrange for it. She would, in 3 weeks, set her hand to every plate in the Strickland Park kitchen, every entry in the Dower House cellar book, every seat at the 12th night ball. By the Epiphany, the matter would be brought to the point at which any sensible person would have said the Duke had recovered his reason and the music teacher had gone home. She would not, however, anticipate Mr. Holroyd, Mrs. Briggs, or the village of Wexford. She would not, above all, anticipate her nephew. She had thought of him, since he was 11 years old, as a steady boy of moderate gifts, who would do as a Sefton was expected to do, in the time a Sefton was expected to do it. She had not yet had occasion, by the night of the 4th of December, to revise that estimate. She would, by the 12th night ball, have revised it. By the May following, when the lilacs by the conservatory door had come at last, and the warm air smelled of them through the open window, she would have revised it again, and would have asked her nephew's wife to call her Margaret. But she did not yet know any of this on the evening of the 4th of December, when she set down her glass at the high table and saw her nephew, the new Duke of Wexford, rise from his place and walk the length of the polished oak floor. He walked. The county watched. Miss Catherine Brooks did not look up. She did not look up. Her father had told her, in her first formal evening in society at 15, that a young woman in a room may always be looked at, but that she chooses what she shall see. She had chosen, on the night of the 4th of December at Wexford Hall, that she would see the candlelight on the polished wood between her bread and her glass. She would see, also, with the quietness of a girl who had once at 15, on the day of her mother's funeral, picked up a teapot in the parlour and carried it through to her father without spilling, the empty seat on her right hand where the Duke of Wexford had not yet sat down. Her own hands were quiet on the cloth. She would see the empty chair until, with her own steadiness, she would not be required to see it any longer. But all that lay ahead. On the night itself, the Duke of Wexford had walked the length of his dining room, had bowed to Mrs. Briggs and to Mr. Hodge and to Miss Catherine Brooks, had asked the housekeeper's leave to be set a place, had said to the under-butler, "Mr. Hodge, if your bread should be wanted, I shall be obliged," had asked Miss Brooks, "Miss Brooks, may I?" And Miss Brooks had said, "Your Grace." A chair had been set. He had sat down beside her. The soup had gone cold in the bowls at the high table. Lord Vance had at last taken up his spoon to a soup that was not warm. Lady Anne Strickland had eaten her soup with the steady fortitude her governess had drilled into her, and had not looked down the table once. The Marquis of Strickland had eaten his soup, lifted his glass quietly to the Dowager, and said, "Margaret, I have always thought your nephew an interesting young man." The Dowager had said softly, "I am pleased you find him so." The Marquis had not pursued the topic. At the servants' table, the Duke of Wexford had asked Mrs. Briggs how the under-coachman's father had been that week with his gout. Mrs. Briggs had said the gout had been bad on Monday and Tuesday, and was now improving. The Duke had said he was glad of it. Mr. Hodge had asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who had served 3 dukes, whether his Grace would take the fish at his elbow. The Duke had said he would. Mrs. Briggs had asked Miss Brooks how she had found Wexford Village. Miss Brooks had said the village was prettily set, and the church had a fine east window. The Duke had said the window had been put in 1771 by his grandfather. Miss Brooks had said it did the family great credit. The Duke had said, very quietly, "Miss Brooks, thank you." She had not been certain what she was being thanked for. She had said, "Your Grace?" The fish was carried away. The roast was carried in. At the high table, Lady Margaret had begun a conversation with Lord Vance on the topic of his bill in committee. Lord Vance had taken the cue. He had spoken quietly for 15 minutes on the precise composition of the committee, the difficulties he had encountered with the second clause, the necessity of 3 particular amendments. Lady Margaret had listened. The Marquis had listened. Lady Anne had listened. The Reverend Pellow had listened. The Dowager had not looked in 15 minutes down the length of the table once. Mrs. Briggs had set her hand a 1/4 inch closer to her teacup. The roast was carried away. The pudding was carried in. It was a black pudding, of the sort the previous Duke had liked. The current Duke ate it without expression. Miss Brooks ate it with the same. Lord Vance, at the high table, finished his 5th clause. By 9:30 the Duke had risen, had bowed to Mrs. Briggs and to Mr. Hodge and to Miss Brooks, had said his good nights to the table at large, had walked the length of the room past 24 silent faces, and had gone alone to the long library at the east end of the house. The county had been left. He would later say to Mr. Holroyd, in March of the following year, that the 4 hours of that evening had been the 4 hours during which he had become, for the first time in his life, a man rather than a Sefton. He would not say this for some weeks. He would say it, finally, on the morning of the day on which he handed Mr. Holroyd a folded letter for Lord Vance. But that lay ahead. On the night of the 4th of December, in the long library at the east end of the house, the Duke of Wexford sat alone, with a brandy he did not drink, and a black japanned box he had been waiting to open since the funeral. And he read through, for the first time, the 4 letters from Dr. Edward Brooks of Bath. He set them in their packet. He set the packet beside the brandy. He turned, in his chair, to the long window that gave upon the avenue, and watched the snow that had begun, very lightly, to fall in the avenue at 11:30. He did not, on that night, know what he would do next. He did not know that Lord Vance was writing, by candlelight in his own room at the Hall, a letter that would be in his Grace's hand by 9 the next morning. He did not know that the Dowager Lady Margaret, in her small sitting room on the floor above his own, had set her hand to a list of 17 names for the 12th night ball at the Dower House. He did not know that, 3 rooms beyond the Dowager's, Lady Anne Strickland had not yet undressed for bed, but sat at the small writing desk by the cold window, looking at her father's silver signet ring upon her own finger. The fire had burned low. She had not yet decided what she would write home. He knew only that, 4 hours earlier, in his own dining room, Miss Catherine Brooks had not looked up at him, and that he had walked. He thought of his father. He thought he would not yet write to anyone. He turned out the lamp at midnight. He went up to bed. In her small bare room at the Boar's Head, Miss Catherine Brooks had set her one black silk evening dress over the back of the chair, had washed her face with cold water, had taken her father's last letter from her writing case, had read it through twice, and had set it on the small deal table by the window. She had unbound her hair. She had brushed it through. She had not cried. She had thought, and this is the sentence she would later remember of that night, of all the sentences she had thought, that the Duke of Wexford had risen and walked and bowed to Mrs. Briggs, and asked her own permission for a seat, and that no one in her life had ever asked her permission for very much. She had set the brush down. She had blown out the candle. She had gone to sleep. It would be the boy from the village, knocking on the lattice at 7:30 with the second post, who would bring her the first of the 3 letters before her 11 o'clock church service. The post had come early. The postmaster had instructed him to knock for her in particular, on the grounds that the matter was of some urgency, my dear, by the look of the seals. Miss Brooks had risen, drawn on her shawl, opened the lattice, taken the letters, given the boy a halfpenny, closed the lattice softly. The cold morning wind smelled of smoke from the inn-yard fire. She sat down upon the bed. The first letter was from her uncle, Mr. Joseph Hayward, attorney at York. The second was from Mrs. Linfield, head-mistress of the seminary at Bath. The third was from Mr. Henry Holroyd, of Wexford Hall. She had broken the seal on her uncle's letter first, as a niece ought. Her uncle wrote, his hand steady, the paper warm where the parlour fire had touched it, that he had received her letters of the 25th and the 28th of November, and was very pleased to hear of his Grace's straightforward conduct in the matter of the bequest. He was further pleased to hear that the papers were prepared. He hoped she would be at York by the Wednesday. He sent his love and his sister's. He had added, in a postscript in a different ink, that he had called upon a barrister of his acquaintance, Mr. Edmonds, on the Saturday previous, and that Mr. Edmonds had told him of a conversation overheard in his own clerk's room, concerning a gentleman of his Grace's standing, and a young woman of unspecified name. Her uncle had written in a quieter hand, "Catherine, I commit it to your good sense. Conduct yourself as you have always done." He had signed, "Your affectionate uncle, Joseph Hayward." She had read the postscript through twice. She had broken the seal on Mrs. Linfield's letter second. Miss Catherine Brooks had set the 2 letters down upon the bed. She had broken the seal on Mr. Henry Holroyd's letter third. Mr. Holroyd wrote that he was the Duke of Wexford's man of business, that he had been present at her interview in the library the previous Thursday, that he had been the boy whose sister, Dr. Edward Brooks, had saved of a pleurisy in the spring of 1804. He had owed her father, in his own private accounting, more than he was likely to be able to pay in this life. He hoped she would forgive his addressing her without a more formal introduction, and begged the favour of a half-hour of her time at the Boar's Head Inn on the present morning, at any hour she would name, on a matter of the gravest concern to her own good name and to the household at Wexford Hall. He had signed, "Your obedient servant, Henry Holroyd." His own hand was steady on the ink. Miss Catherine Brooks had set the third letter down upon the bed. She had risen. She had washed her face in cold water from the chipped white jug. She had dressed in the half-morning lavender, which was clean. She had bound her hair. She had gone down to the inn's small parlour and ordered a pot of tea, the warm smell of bread and bacon in the corridor. She had asked the innkeeper's wife, a Mrs. Trowbridge, who had laid her cloak for her 2 evenings before, whether a Mr. Henry Holroyd, the Duke's man of business, was known at the inn. Mrs. Trowbridge had said he was a respectable gentleman. He lived 2 miles out, at the small house his father had purchased after the war. Miss Brooks had asked whether the boy who had run to the post might carry a note. Mrs. Trowbridge had said he could. Miss Brooks had written, in her own steady, schoolroom neat hand, "Mr. Holroyd, I shall be at the inn the whole morning. Pray come at any hour. C. Brooks." She had sealed it with a drop of warm wax. She had given the boy a penny and the note. She had sat down at the small parlour window with her tea. She had waited. Mr. Henry Holroyd arrived at the inn at 10:30. He was a man of perhaps 35, with thinning brown hair and a face broken at the cheekbone in some old accident, in a black coat and white cravat, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He bowed deeply to Miss Brooks as he came into the parlour. He took the chair she offered. He said, "Miss Brooks, your servant. I beg you will forgive my coming." She said, "Mr. Holroyd, you are very welcome." Mrs. Trowbridge had set down a second cup. Mr. Holroyd took his tea black and without sugar. He had spoken, in the first quarter of an hour, of her father. He had spoken of Dr. Brooks coming to the sick room of his own sister Lucy in the May of 1804. The doctor had ridden over from Bath in the warm spring rain, his coat dark with wet, and had sat with the child 11 hours without leaving the chair. He had brought down the pleurisy by methods Mr. Holroyd's mother had, in her last illness in 1809, asked her son to set down in writing for any other family similarly afflicted. Mr. Holroyd had written them down. He had added, in the same letter, that Lucy was now a married woman, with 2 children of her own, and that she had lit a candle for Dr. Brooks every 5th of November since the year of her recovery. The wax, he said, had pooled silver white on the wooden sill. Mr. Holroyd had said, "Miss Brooks, you may take it that there are houses in this county in which your father is named with prayer, and that mine is one of them." Miss Catherine Brooks had not been able for some seconds to speak. She had set her hand on the table to steady it. She had said, at last, "Mr. Holroyd, you are very kind." He had then come to his business. He had set the leather portfolio upon the table. He had said quietly, "Miss Brooks, His Grace does not yet know that I am here. I am here because I have been 30 hours in a household that has begun to speak with 2 voices. Because I have known Lady Margaret 8 years in my professional capacity, because I have known His Grace 11, and because I am, by a debt that predates them both, of your father's party. I shall not deceive His Grace. I shall tell him I have come this morning, the moment I return to the hall. But I shall come, by your leave, before I tell him." Miss Brooks had said, "Mr. Holroyd, you may speak." He had spoken for 3/4 of an hour. He had told her of Lord Vance's letter, which had reached Wexford Hall at 9 that morning under a cold seal of green wax, requesting, in stiff and careful terms, a private interview with the Duke on a matter of mutual concern touching the public reputation of your Grace's household. He had told her of the Dowager's note to the kitchen, the smell of bacon and warm bread already in the corridor, which had countermanded the cook's order for the Sunday luncheon party, and had replaced it with an instruction for a private breakfast for the Dowager, Lord Vance, and the Marquis of Strickland alone. He had told her of Lady Anne Strickland's letter to her mother, carried out by a footman at 6 in the morning, 6 pages long, resealed twice by Mr. Hodges' account in the boot room, with the smell of saddle soap and dubbin still on his hands. He had told her of the talk in the village, of the talk in the servants' hall, and by his own brother's account by the Morning Post, of the talk in the warm coffee room at the George at Lincoln on the morning of the 5th. He had then said, "Miss Brooks, I will not advise you. I am not entitled. I will, by your leave, tell you what I think." She had said, "Mr. Holroyd, I shall be obliged." He had said, "I think His Grace went to the servants' table, because he had been pressed by his aunt to put you in a place which would have caused you to leave Wexford in the small hours of the morning. I think he went, in the matter of the seating plan, by way of a cowardice, by his own confession to me at 1 in the morning of the 26th of November. I think he learnt of the cowardice at his own dining table, in the time it took for the soup to be carried in. I think, Miss Brooks, that what your father did for the late Duke in the November of 1812, His Grace did, in his own measure, for you on the night of the 4th of December. I think he is a young man with a great deal still to learn, and an extreme reluctance to learn any of it in any room where another man may see him learning it. I think you have, by being placed at the servants' table, and by not flinching, taught him more in 3 minutes than his aunt taught him in 3 years. I think he will be the better Duke for it. I think, however—" He had paused, and his voice had dropped, the warm smell of his pipe tobacco hanging between them. "I think Lord Vance has not come to Wexford on a matter of his bill in committee. He has come on a matter which he believes will be of considerable convenience to himself and to her ladyship the Dowager. I think he will name his price of His Grace this morning, and I think, Miss Brooks, that you must know this before you go to church." Miss Catherine Brooks had said, very softly, "Mr. Holroyd, what price?" Mr. Holroyd had said quietly, "Lord Vance has loose letters of your father's, written by Dr. Brooks to the late Duke between 1809 and 1812, taken from a portfolio in the late Duke's writing desk, distinct from the sealed packet His Grace opened on Saturday night. They are kept in a wrapper labelled in Lord Vance's own hand, and he has not, to my certain knowledge, opened them. I know he intends to suggest to His Grace this morning that he will not open them, provided His Grace make public announcement of his engagement to Lady Anne Strickland not later than 12th night." The parlour clock at the Boar's Head Inn struck 11. Miss Catherine Brooks had not flinched. She had said, after the clock had ceased, "Mr. Holroyd, where would Lord Vance have obtained my father's letters?" Mr. Holroyd had said, "By the hand of her ladyship the Dowager Lady Margaret, on the morning of the 2nd of December, in her own sitting room, in the presence of no other person but a footman, whom Lady Margaret has since paid." Miss Catherine Brooks had set her teacup down. She had said, "Mr. Holroyd, I am very much obliged to you." She had risen. She had said, "I shall go to church. I shall play the pianoforte in the conservatory at Wexford Hall this afternoon at the Duke's invitation, as I had promised yesterday, because I have promised. I shall not, however, be driven by Lord Vance or by Lady Margaret. I shall consider what is to be done. Will you come to me, sir, tomorrow morning at this hour?" Mr. Holroyd had said, "I shall." She had said, "And, Mr. Holroyd, will you tell His Grace, when you next see him, that I have asked you nothing, but I have, this morning, taken counsel of an old friend of my father's family, that I have not the smallest intention of asking His Grace for any protection, that I shall not, on Lord Vance's account or his aunt's, ask His Grace for so much as a glass of water on Sunday afternoon." Mr. Holroyd had said, "Miss Brooks, I shall." She had bowed him out of the parlour. She had stood at the parlour window for 10 minutes, her hands cold, the church bell still ringing somewhere down the village street, and thought of her father, her aunt at York, and the 4 letters in the packet. She had thought of the Duke, and had not yet known what to think of him. She had picked up her bonnet and gone to church. At Wexford Hall that morning, the Duke of Wexford had risen at 6, had ridden out alone in the half-light along the bridle path behind the kitchen gardens, his breath white, his hands cold, and had come down to the small breakfast room at 8:30 to find his aunt seated at the head of the table, with Lord Vance on her left and the Marquis of Strickland on her right. He had stopped at the door. He had said, "Aunt." The Dowager had said, "Alexander, sit down." He had not sat down. He had said, very evenly, "I had thought to take breakfast in the morning room." The Dowager had said, "You will take it here." Lord Vance had said, "Wexford, pray do." The Duke had crossed the room and had sat down opposite his aunt at the foot of the small table. He had taken a cup of coffee from the sideboard at his own hand. He had not spoken for 2 minutes together. The Marquis of Strickland had finished a forkful of kidney. Lord Vance had set down his own cup. Lord Vance had said, "Wexford, I shall come to the point." The Duke had said, "Pray do, Vance." Lord Vance had spoken for 10 minutes, in the order he had rehearsed coming down the stair. The affair of the previous evening at the servants' table had been observed by every person in the room. An account of it would be in 3 London papers by Wednesday at the latest. The matter could yet be retrieved by a public engagement. He himself, with the Dowager Lady Margaret's full concurrence, would account it a personal courtesy to be permitted to announce His Grace's engagement to Lady Anne Strickland at the 12th night ball at the Dower House. In the absence of such an announcement, certain letters, which had recently come into Lord Vance's hands, written by a private gentleman of Bath to the late Duke of Wexford between 1809 and 1812, might fall to be discussed in the press in a manner that would not, in his lordship's view, do credit to the writer or the recipient. Lord Vance, being a man of regular habit and modest ambition, was content to leave the packet sealed, provided His Grace would confirm, before the breakfast-room party rose from table, that the engagement would stand. The smell of bacon had cooled on the sideboard. Lord Vance had taken his coffee quietly. The Marquis of Strickland had not spoken. The Dowager had not spoken. The Duke of Wexford had set his own cup down. He had said, "Vance, the letters." Lord Vance had said, "Quite, Your Grace." The Duke had said, "The packet." Lord Vance had said, "In my possession, Wexford. By private route I shall not detail." The Duke had said, and this is the sentence Mr. Holroyd, coming in at the small breakfast-room door at the precise moment, with the leather portfolio under his arm, would later say he had heard, and would carry with him through the rest of his employment at Wexford Hall. "Vance, you have my answer at 5 o'clock this evening. Until then, I shall be at church, and in my own house with my own thoughts. Art, I shall be obliged if you will receive Miss Brooks in the conservatory at 3. Mr. Holroyd, you will be present." Lord Vance had said, "Wexford, your answer must be." The Duke had said, 5 o'clock, Vance, not before." He had risen quietly. He had walked out of the small breakfast room. Mr. Holroyd had stood aside at the door. The Duke had paused in the corridor for 1/2 second, and had said, very quiet, "Holroyd, I have something to say to you. In the library, in a 1/4 of an hour." Mr. Holroyd had said, "Your Grace." The Duke had walked on. In the library, a 1/4 of an hour later, Mr. Holroyd had stood, hat in hand. The fire crackled softly behind him. The smell of beeswax polish hung over the long table. He had said quietly, "Your Grace, I have been to Miss Brooks this morning, at my own initiative. I shall give my notice at noon, if you wish it. I have told her of the letters. She has asked nothing of me or of the household. She has asked only that I tell your Grace she takes counsel of an old friend of her father's family, and that she shall not, on Lord Vance's or Lady Margaret's account, ask of your Grace so much as a glass of water on Sunday afternoon." The Duke of Wexford had looked at Mr. Holroyd for 10 seconds together, without speaking. He had then said, Holroyd, you will not give your notice. You will sit down in that chair. You will tell me every word she said, every word you said, from the first knock at her lattice this morning to the moment you bowed her out of the parlour. And then, Holroyd, we shall together write the answer Lord Vance will have of me at 5 o'clock. Mr. Holroyd had sat down. He had told him. The Duke had listened without writing. He had said, at the end, only, Holroyd, my father's snuff-box. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace? The Duke had said, My father pressed it into my hand the morning after the King cut him at Carlton House, in the September of 1794. He said a Sefton may grieve, but not in any room where another man may see him grieve. I have carried it 19 years. I shall, on the matter of Lord Vance, carry it a little farther. I shall not, on the matter of Miss Brooks, carry it a step. Holroyd, what time is the church? Mr. Holroyd had said, 11, Your Grace. The Duke had said, We shall go. They had gone. The Duke of Wexford had sat in the family pew at the Church of St. Margaret's at Wexford in the second row, where his father had sat for 30 years. The cold stone of the church pressed up through the wooden boards under his knees. He had stood for the prayers. He had knelt at the proper place. He had not turned his head during the sermon, which was a careful sermon of the Reverend Pellows on the theme of The Kingdom of God is among you. He had not, at any point, looked across the aisle to the pew of strangers, where Miss Catherine Brooks sat with her hands one upon the other in her lap, listening with the same care she had heard her father give one of his own at the Bath Assembly Rooms in the December of 1808. She had not turned her head, either. They had come out of church at 12:30. The Dowager had returned to Wexford Hall in her own carriage with the Marquis and Lord Vance. The Duke had walked back, alone, by the lane behind the rectory. He had taken his time. He had reached the hall at 1:15. He had dined at the small breakfast-room table with Lady Anne Strickland and Mr. Holroyd. He had said almost nothing. Lady Anne had said almost nothing. Mr. Holroyd had spoken twice of the weather. The Dowager had been absent. The Marquis and Lord Vance had taken their meal in the Dowager's sitting-room. At 3 o'clock the Duke had walked quietly into the conservatory at the south end of Wexford Hall, where the pianoforte stood beneath the long sloping glass, and the orange trees in their tubs gave off the cold, dry scent of November greenery, and where Miss Brooks, in her half-morning lavender, had been shown in by Mrs. Briggs 5 minutes earlier. Mr. Holroyd had come in at the same moment, with a chair for himself. The Dowager had not come. Miss Brooks had risen when the Duke entered. She had said, Your Grace. He had bowed. He had said, Miss Brooks, thank you for coming. She had said, I had promised. He had said, You had. She had inclined her head. She had said, Your Grace, shall I begin? He had said, Pray do. She had taken the seat at the pianoforte. She had begun to play. The Duke had listened for 15 minutes together without speaking. At the end of the Haydn movement, she had stopped, had set her hands in her lap, and had said, very quietly, Your Grace, will you sit down? He had sat down. She had said, I shall play one more. Then I should be obliged if Your Grace would tell me what you mean to do, this afternoon, before 5 o'clock. He had stared at her for 2 seconds. He had said, Holroyd. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace? The Duke had said, She knows. Mr. Holroyd had said, She does, Your Grace. I told her. The Duke had looked quietly at Miss Brooks. He had said, Miss Brooks, I shall tell you, after this movement, if it pleases you. She had said, It pleases me. She had played one further movement of Mr. Haydn's. The Duke had listened. The orange trees had stood. Mr. Holroyd had read his paper. The sun had moved 1 inch along the floor. She had stopped. She had set her hands in her lap. The Duke had said, very quiet, Miss Brooks, I shall not announce an engagement to Lady Anne Strickland tonight, tomorrow, on 12th night, or in this lifetime. I shall write Lord Vance at 5 o'clock, that he may publish what he chooses. I shall also write, before that hour, to a barrister at the Inner Temple, with a request that he take up the letters and discover by what route they have left this house. I shall then go to bed. Tomorrow morning, with Mr. Holroyd's help, I shall set this house in such order that Lord Vance's threat shall not be of consequence to your father's memory, or to anyone in it. She had said, Your Grace. He had said, Miss Brooks. I do not ask anything of you. I tell you, as you asked me to tell you. I have not done it for you to thank me. I have done it because, by my own confession, I should have done it on the 26th of November and did not, and because I shall not, in this house, be again the man who did not. She had set her hand on the polished wood of the pianoforte's edge. She had said, with a steadiness she would not afterward remember having mustered, Your Grace, I had thought this morning, in the parlour at the inn, that I should leave Wexford on Monday, with Mr. Anstruther's signed papers and my uncle's instruction, and a clean conscience. He had said, Miss Brooks. She had said, I shall stay until Wednesday, Your Grace, because there is a school at the village that has lost its teacher this week, and Mr. Pellow this morning at the church door asked whether I could lend my hand to it for a fortnight. He had said, a fortnight. She had said, if it does not embarrass Your Grace. He had said, Miss Brooks, it does not. She had risen. She had said, I shall now go down to the village, and I shall settle the matter with Mr. Pellow's eldest daughter. Mr. Holroyd has been very kind. Your Grace, I am very much obliged to you for the use of the pianoforte. He had risen also. He had said, Miss Brooks, may I walk with you to the village? She had said, Your Grace, I think not today. You have a letter to write. He had said, I have. She had said, tomorrow, perhaps. He had said, tomorrow. She had curtsied. She had walked out of the conservatory. Mr. Holroyd had set down his folded paper. The Duke of Wexford had stood for 2 minutes together at the pianoforte without moving. He had then said, Holroyd, the letter to Lord Vance. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace. They had written it. By 4:30 it had been folded, sealed with his Grace's signet, and carried by a footman to Lord Vance in the small breakfast-room, where his lordship had sat with the Dowager and the Marquis for an hour and a half, expecting it. Lord Vance had opened it. He had read it through. He had set it down upon the polished oak. He had said, Lady Margaret, your nephew has refused. The Dowager had said, Then he has refused. Lord Vance had said, Your Ladyship, I had thought. The Dowager had said, Lord Vance, you had thought what any reasonable man would have thought in the circumstances. My nephew has, however, ceased, for the time being, to be a reasonable man. Pray be content. We shall see what comes. Lord Vance had said, Madam, the Chronicle. The Dowager had said, By Wednesday, my lord, not before. There is, between Sunday and Wednesday, time for a man to recover his reason, or for a young woman to take ship to Massachusetts. Either will do. Lord Vance had said, Madam, I shall wait. The Dowager had said, You shall wait. The Marquis of Strickland had said, Margaret, my daughter. The Dowager had said, Frederick shall take her home tomorrow, with every appearance of kindness. By Wednesday this matter is to be either resolved or confirmed. Either way, Lady Anne will have done all that her sense and her parts will permit her to do, and shall do no more. The Marquis had said, Margaret. The Dowager had said, Frederick. He had risen. He had left the small breakfast-room. He had gone to find his daughter in the small drawing-room, where Lady Anne Strickland had been seated at the small writing-desk by the window for the better part of an hour, looking at her father's signet ring upon her own finger, and had not yet decided what she would write home. The Marquis had set his hand on her shoulder. He had said, Anne. She had said, Papa. He had said, We shall go home tomorrow. She had said, Yes, Papa. She had not written home that night, either. By Wednesday morning, in the small, bare room at the Boar's Head, the cold smell of old smoke in the curtains, the dust soft on the writing table, Miss Catherine Brooks had spent 2 days at the village school in the parish hall behind St. Margaret's. She had organized the 4 village women whose elder daughters had attended Mrs. Linfield's seminary to keep the school open in the absence of the Reverend Pellow's eldest daughter. On the Tuesday morning, she had stood in the parish hall, her hand quiet on the iron lock of the schoolroom door, before the parish bailiff, Mr. Tarvitt, who had come down from the bishop's office to advise the wardens that the school must be closed. She had said, very softly, that no school of the bishop's office in any parish of the Riding had ever yet been closed by reason of 1 fortnight's absence, that she would write the bishop herself if Mr. Tarvitt thought it proper, and that the school would, in any case, be open at 9 on Wednesday morning under Mrs. Burdett's hand. Mr. Tarvitt had blinked at her over his spectacles. He had said, Miss Brooks. She had said, Sir. He had said, I shall confer with the wardens. She had said, Pray do, Mr. Tarvitt. He had withdrawn, his boots loud on the flagstones. The Duke of Wexford had been at the back of the parish hall the whole of the conversation, having come down from the hall by way of the lane behind the rectory on the pretext of a tenant inquiry. He had heard every word. He had not spoken. He had not been seen by Miss Brooks. He had walked back up to the hall in the early dusk of a December afternoon, and had said to Mr. Holroyd in the library, with his hand on the back of a chair, Holroyd, she does not need me at all. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace, that is, if I may, exactly the point. The Duke had said quietly, Holroyd, tomorrow, after I have signed Mr. Anstruther's papers, I shall walk down to the inn at noon and ask Miss Brooks whether she will permit me, without any other purpose, to walk her on Friday morning to the conservatory at the hall. She shall play the pianoforte a quarter of an hour. I shall not ask her anything. I shall thank her and walk her back. By Saturday I shall write her uncle at York. By Monday I shall ride to York. By the Wednesday following, I shall ask her uncle's consent to address her, and if his answer is yes, I shall come back and ask hers. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace, that is the proper order of things. The Duke had said, Holroyd, it is, however, 4 days too long. Lord Vance is at the Chronicle on Wednesday. Holroyd, Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace, I beg you will sit down. The Duke had sat down. He had looked into the fire. He had said, Holroyd, what would my father have done? Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace, your father would have ridden to York tomorrow at first light, and to Bath the day after, and to Lincoln the day after that, and would not have slept in his own bed before Christmas Eve. Your father, Your Grace, would have torn Lord Vance's threat to such ribbons by the Tuesday evening that Lord Vance, by the Wednesday morning, would have written you a note begging the favor of a quiet conversation in your study. Your father, Your Grace, would not have written the Times. Your father would have made Lord Vance write the Times in apology of his own accord. The Duke had looked quietly at Mr. Holroyd for half a minute together. He had said, Holroyd, the horses. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace, the bays are fresh. The Duke had said, 5 in the morning. Mr. Holroyd had said, 5, Your Grace. The Duke had said, And Holroyd, a note to Miss Brooks, by Mrs. Briggs's hand, to be delivered tomorrow morning, no earlier than 9:30. Say to her, in my name, that I have ridden to York on a small matter of estate business, that I shall be returned by the Friday evening, that I beg her to remain at the inn until I have come back, and that I shall come to her on Saturday morning at any hour she will name. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace. The Duke had said, Holroyd, sit down. Mr. Holroyd had sat down. The Duke had said, Holroyd, if I do not come back by Friday. Mr. Holroyd had said, Your Grace? The Duke had said quietly, "If, Holroyd, I do not come back by Friday, for any reason at all, you will give Miss Brooks the black japanned box on the writing desk, the letters from her father to mine, labelled in my father's hand. Give them to her in person. Tell her in my name that they are her father's, that they have been kept safely for her, and that I had not the words to say what they contain. Tell her the words I had not are these. My father trusted hers, and I should be obliged to trust her, if she would permit me." Mr. Holroyd had said, "Your Grace." The Duke had said, "And Holroyd, the snuff-box." Mr. Holroyd had said, "Your Grace." The Duke had reached into his coat. He had set the small, worn silver snuff-box on the writing desk. He had said, "Holroyd, the snuff-box you will not give her. You will keep it from me. I shall not, when I come back, be needing it any longer." Mr. Holroyd had set his hand over the snuff-box. He had said, "Your Grace, I shall keep it." Mr. Holroyd had said, "Your Grace, you shall have both." The Duke had said, "Thank you, Holroyd." He had stood at the window a moment longer. The note to Miss Brooks was written that night, in Mrs. Briggs's care, and was delivered at 9:30 on the Wednesday morning to the small parlour of the Boar's Head. Miss Brooks was reading aloud a passage from the second book of Mr. Hooker's Ecclesiastical Polity, which her father had set her at 16, and which she returned to in moments of distress. The wax of the seal was still warm when she broke it. She read the note. She said, very quiet, to Mrs. Briggs, who waited by the parlour door, "Mrs. Briggs, he's ridden to York." Mrs. Briggs had said, "He has, miss. He left at 5. Miss Brooks had said, "Mrs. Briggs, is he well?" Mrs. Briggs had said, "Miss, he is, I do believe, though I had not, in 26 years, seen him so quiet at 5 in the morning. He had given his snuff-box to Mr. Holroyd, miss, the night before. I had seen him do it. He had not been carrying it when he came down to the courtyard." Miss Brooks had set the note down upon the parlour table. She had said, "Mrs. Briggs, I shall stay until Saturday morning, as His Grace has asked." Mrs. Briggs had said, "Miss." She had inclined her head 1/2 inch. She had withdrawn. Miss Catherine Brooks had stood at the parlour window for 10 minutes together, with her hands one upon the other in front of her, looking down the village street toward the church. She had thought, very softly, of her father. She had thought of her aunt at York. She had thought of the Duke of Wexford, who had not, by Mrs. Briggs's account, been carrying his snuff-box when he came down to the courtyard at 5 in the morning. She had thought she would, after all, write to her uncle. She had sat down. She had written her uncle a letter of 1 page, in her steady, schoolroom neat hand, the ink cold, the paper warm where her left hand pressed it flat. She had written that the matter of the bequest was concluding well. There had been a difficulty at the dinner of Saturday evening, of which her uncle would have heard from Mrs. Linfield. The difficulty had been, in her view, occasioned more by the Dowager Lady Margaret Sefton than by any want of consideration in His Grace, who has, in every particular, conducted himself as Papa would have wished. She had written that the Reverend Pellow had asked her to lend her hand to the parish school for a fortnight, that she had consented, and that she would write again on the Saturday. She had signed, "Your affectionate niece, Catherine Brooks." She had sealed the letter. She had set it on the small table by the door for the boy to take to the post in the afternoon. She had gone down to the parish school. By the Friday afternoon, the Duke of Wexford had ridden to York with Mr. Holroyd in His Grace's curricle, the wind sharp off the moor, and his hands cold inside his gloves. He had called upon Mr. Joseph Hayward at his attorney's chambers in Stonegate, had sat 2 hours over a coal fire that smoked, had taken tea with Mrs. Hayward, and had walked across to the Minster Yard alone with Mr. Hayward, the smell of cold stone heavy in the cloister. He had returned quietly to the Black Swan with 3 letters in his portfolio, 1 to Lord Vance, 1 to the editor of the Times, and 1 written privately and not yet sealed. By the Saturday morning he had ridden back to Wexford, had reached the hall at noon, and had walked down to the Boar's Head at 12:30. He had asked Mrs. Trowbridge for Miss Brooks. Miss Brooks had come down from her room. She had said, Your Grace? He had said, Miss Brooks. He had asked her whether she would permit him to walk with her to the conservatory at the Hall, but he had a small matter to lay before her. She had said she would. She had taken her bonnet and her cloak. They had walked up the avenue together. He had not spoken. She had not spoken. The snow on the verge of the avenue was crisp under their feet. The bare branches of the oaks above them stood out against the pale December sky. The smoke from the kitchen chimney at the Hall rose straight in the still air. At the conservatory door, he had stood aside for her. She had gone quietly in. The orange trees stood in their tubs. The pianoforte stood beneath the long, sloping glass. The early afternoon sun, low and pale, came through the glass and lit the lavender of her pelisse and the dark wood of the pianoforte. Mrs. Briggs and Mr. Holroyd, by the Duke's prior instruction, were not in the room. They were alone. He had said, Miss Brooks. When do you sit down? She had sat down at the pianoforte. He had said, I shall not ask you to play. She had set her hands in her lap. His hands were cold from the road. His coat smelled of horse sweat and wet wool. He said quietly, Miss Brooks, I have ridden to York. I have spoken with your uncle, Mr. Hayward, for 2 hours and a half. I have laid before him every matter that has touched you since the 11th of November, and every matter that has touched me, as honestly as I am able. I have asked his consent to address you. He has given it. His breath caught in his throat. He has given it on condition that I tell you he gives it on his own account, not yours, that his consent is not yours, and that I make my address on my own honor. I have agreed. Miss Catherine Brooks had set her hand on the polished wood of the pianoforte's edge. She had said, Your Grace? He had said quietly, Miss Brooks. One further small matter before I make my address. There was a packet of 4 letters from your father to mine on the late Duke's fever in March of 1809, which were in my father's japanned box on the library writing desk, and which I had not opened until the night of the 4th of December. I took them to York. I spent 4 hours with them on the journey out, and 4 on the journey back. I should be obliged if you would permit me to give them to you before any other word passes. They are your father's. They were kept by mine. I have no business with them. He had drawn the packet from his coat. He had held it out to her. She had taken it. She had broken the seal of the outer wrapper. She had unfolded the first letter. She had read aloud, very quiet, for she could not, with the Duke standing 2 feet from her, read it in quiet. The first line of her father's hand. My dear Wexford, your fever, by the symptoms you describe, is no return of the spring complaint, but a new accident, and you will please me by setting down at once whatever it is you have been carrying in private, and writing to me of it before the post is closed. She had set the letter down upon the polished wood of the pianoforte. She had said, Your Grace, my father, wrote so to your father. He had said, He did, Miss Brooks. She had said, My father was so hurt. He had said, He was. She had looked at the second letter. She had said, Your Grace, I shall read them this evening at the inn, with your permission. I shall return them to you on the Monday. I shall keep, if you will permit me, the second only, the one in which Papa speaks of myself. He had said, Miss Brooks, they are yours. They are not for return. She had said, Your Grace, your father. He had said, Miss Brooks, my father had a Sefton's habit of keeping in his own desk what would have served him better in his daughter's hand. I shall not perpetuate the habit. They are yours. Keep them. She had set her hand on the packet. She had said, very quiet, Your Grace, I thank you. He had said, Miss Brooks, may I make my address? She had said, Your Grace, pray do. He had said, and Mrs. Briggs, who had stood in the small anteroom at the conservatory's outer door by Mr. Holroyd's prior instruction, her back turned, her hands clasped warm behind her, the smell of orange blossom and damp earth coming from the glasshouse, would later say to her sister at Lincoln that she had heard not a word of it. The door had been all but shut. She had heard the Duke speak for perhaps 4 minutes in a voice she had not before heard him use. She had heard Miss Brooks reply in a voice equally new. The conversation had ended without raised voices, and with a silence of perhaps 30 seconds afterward, in which she had not dared to breathe. He had said, in his own voice and not his father's, what he had to say to Miss Catherine Brooks in the conservatory at Wexford Hall on the morning of the 11th of December, 1813. He had told her that, since the 11th of November, he had been a man very near the point at which a body must either weep or break. On the night of the 25th, in the library, with Mr. Holroyd present, he had been at the point of breaking. Her steadiness, the steadiness with which she had asked him before any other thing what her father had asked of his, had set him back a measurable distance, and he had not, in the days since, walked any farther from it. He had told her that he had ridden to York, that her uncle had heard him with patience, and had told him, at the end of 2 hours and a half, that he was content to leave the matter to his niece. He had told her there was a vast deal she did not yet know about him. There were habits he had been taught, by men he had loved, which would be the work of years to unlearn. He would not, on this morning, before her, promise more than that. He had told her that he had ceased to carry his father's snuff-box, that he intended not to carry it again, and that the cold absence of it in his coat was the substance of the address he had come to make. He had told her that he had no business asking her to consider him for any reason at all. He had no claim on her consideration. He was, however, asking it. If she should think proper to consider his suit, he would be more grateful to her than he had been to any creature in his life. If she should think proper to refuse, he would respect the refusal, as he had respected her steadiness, and would see her father's bequest concluded and her safely to York, with such peace of mind as it was in his power to give her. He had no further matter to lay before her. He was at her disposal to answer any question she might wish to put. He had said at the end, "Miss Brooks." She had said, very quiet, "Your Grace." She had looked, for the first time in the conversation, directly at him. Her grey eyes had been steady. Her hand had been on the packet of her father's letters, on the polished wood of the pianoforte. The early afternoon sun, low and pale, had come through the long-sloping glass, and had lit the lavender of her pelisse, and his dark coat, and the small worn black ribbon at her throat. She had said, "Your Grace, I shall consider." He had said, "Miss Brooks." She had said, "I shall consider this evening, at the inn. I shall give your Grace my answer at 10:30 tomorrow morning, by Mrs. Trowbridge's hand." He had said, "Miss Brooks, Mrs. Trowbridge will not carry your answer. I shall come for it myself." She had said, "Your Grace." She had risen. He had bowed. She had walked out of the conservatory with the packet of her father's letters in her hand. Mrs. Briggs, in the small anteroom, had not turned. Mr. Holroyd, in the corridor beyond, had stood aside. The Duke of Wexford had stood at the pianoforte for 2 minutes together without moving, and had then turned and walked out of the conservatory by the south door. By 10:30 the following morning, Sunday the 12th of December, Miss Catherine Brooks would have written her answer in her own hand, on a small, folded sheet of the inn's plain paper, and would have given it to the Duke of Wexford, in the small parlour of the Boar's Head, at the moment he came in by the inn door. The answer would be 1 line. The Duke would read it. He would set it in his coat. He would say, "Miss Brooks." She would say, "Your Grace." He would say, "Will you walk?" They would walk. But that morning was not yet. The days between the 11th of December and the morning of 12th night would yet hold one further turn of Lord Vance and the Dowager Lady Margaret, who had not, on the receipt of the Times the Wednesday following, in which the Duke's own letter to the editor would withdraw any imputation that he was, or had ever been, engaged to Lady Anne Strickland, yet exhausted her instruments. She had one instrument left. She would use it on the evening of the 5th of January, at the Dower House, in her own small sitting-room, alone with Miss Brooks, for 1/4 of an hour before the ball. She would attempt to settle the matter by private conversation with the young woman before her nephew came in. She would be defeated. She would be defeated by Miss Catherine Brooks, in her one black silk evening dress, which was now Miss Catherine Brooks's own, and had been let out at the shoulders by Mrs. Trowbridge at the inn over the past 3 weeks at her own insistence. She would be defeated quietly, in 15 minutes, by a single sentence Miss Brooks would speak at the 11th minute, and by the quality of the silence Miss Brooks would maintain at the 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th. The single sentence would be, "Lady Margaret, I have been, all my life, a doctor's daughter. I have learned from my father that the proper question to ask of any patient is not what she will give up, but what she will not." Lady Margaret Sefton would set down her teacup. She would not, after that sentence, attempt a second. She would wait, in quiet, the further 4 minutes, until her nephew the Duke came in. She would rise. She would say, "Alexander, Miss Brooks." She would walk past them out of the small sitting room. She would not return. She would attend the ball, dance once with the Marquis, and retire at midnight. The Duke of Wexford would dance the first dance of the ball with Miss Catherine Brooks before the assembled county, with the slow, steady cadence of a country dance the Duke's father had loved. She would dance the second with Mr. Holroyd, at his Grace's request. She would dance the third with the Reverend Pellow, seated at supper with the housekeeper, an arrangement the housekeeper had approved without comment. But the Dowager had not yet, on the evening of the 5th of January, been defeated. The lilacs by the conservatory door had not yet come, and Lord Vance had not yet been answered. Those days between the morning at the inn parlour and the evening at the Dower House, the Duke of Wexford spent in such occupation as a man newly engaged, newly menaced, and newly free of his father's snuff-box could find for himself. He set the household in order. He met with his steward. He wrote to his barrister at the Inner Temple. He wrote, with Mr. Holroyd's help, the letter to the editor of the Times. He wrote a private note to the Marquis of Strickland, in his own hand, asking leave to call on the Thursday. The Marquis had written back, by return post, that he would receive his Grace at 3. They had spoken for an hour and 10 minutes, the Marquis's library cold with the smell of old leather and a damped-down fire, and they had parted with their regard for one another intact. Lady Anne Strickland would, by the Easter following, be engaged to a half-pay colonel of dragoons, whom she had met at her great-aunt's house in Cheltenham. Miss Catherine Brooks, on the same 5 days, had kept her own settled hours. She had walked down to the parish school each morning at 8:30, the cold smelling of wet hedges and slate. She had taught such reading as Mrs. Burdett's 9-year-olds were equal to, from the simpler of the 2 readers that the parish kept at the schoolroom desk. She had taken her dinner at the inn parlour at 1:30. She had walked up to Wexford Hall each afternoon at 3, had spent an hour and a half each afternoon with the Duke of Wexford and Mrs. Briggs and Mr. Holroyd in the conservatory or the long library, the room warm with the smell of wood smoke and old paper, and had walked back to the inn each evening at 5. She had read her father's letters by the parlour fire each evening, the paper warm in her hands and faintly smelling of tobacco. She had read them through twice each. She had kept them, in their packet, on the small deal table by the window beside her writing case. She had written daily to her uncle. She had not written to her aunt. Her aunt would learn of the engagement when the Times reached York, in the proper manner. She had also written, once, to Mrs. Linfield at the seminary in Bath, a letter of 1 page. Mrs. Linfield had read it through twice, and had set her hand to her own writing paper without delay, and had written back that she was very glad indeed, and that she begged Miss Brooks to allow her, Mrs. Linfield, the privilege of standing at the church door at Wexford on the morning of the wedding, when it should come. By the morning of the 5th of January, the Duke of Wexford had not slept past 5 in 7 nights together. He had ridden to Lincoln on the Friday in the matter of Lord Vance, his hands cold inside his gloves, and returned on the Saturday with the loose papers of Dr. Brooks that Lord Vance had held, recovered from his lordship's chambers by the simple expedient of his barrister's threat of a suit at common law for theft of private property held in trust. He had burned them in his own grate at Wexford Hall on the Sunday morning, with Miss Brooks present at her own request. The fire took the paper slowly, the wax curling and hissing. The smoke had stood for a long time in the cold air of the library before it found the chimney. He had written Lord Vance a letter on the Sunday afternoon, on a particular clause of his lordship's bill in committee, indicating that he had withdrawn his support for that clause, and could no longer lend his vote to the bill in its present form. Lord Vance had not replied. He had not, by the Lent following, called upon Wexford. The vote on the bill, by the Duke of Wexford's withdrawal of support, had been carried by a majority of 3, in a form which excluded the clause His Grace had objected to. The clause concerned the disposition of certain Crown property in the West Riding, which the late Duke of Wexford had, in his last 6 months, opposed in writing. The Duke of Wexford had, on the carrying of the bill in its amended form, paid in full the price of his own political career for the next 3 sessions. He had paid it without remark in the small library of Wexford Hall, in the presence only of Mr. Holroyd. The fire crackled softly on the hearth. When the news came down by the morning post, Mr. Holroyd said, "Your Grace, 3 sessions." The Duke said, "Holroyd, I have a duchess." He had not spoken further on the topic. On the evening of the 5th of January, at the Dower House, in the small sitting room behind the great hall, the candles were lit and the tea-things set out. The Dowager Lady Margaret was seated in her own armchair by the fire, the warm smell of wax and wood smoke close about her. Miss Catherine Brooks had been shown in by Lady Margaret's own footman at 6 o'clock, and had been alone with the Dowager for 15 minutes. The Dowager had attempted, in the first 10 of those minutes, to settle the matter by such methods as had served her for 30 years. She had observed that the affair had occasioned a great deal of distress in the household, that her nephew was not, by his nature, equal to the management of a public engagement of this character, that Lady Anne Strickland had been very nearly broken by the matter, and was now in mourning of her own. She had observed, further, that the bequest could, with Miss Brooks's consent, be substantially enlarged, perhaps to £300 the year, in a quiet trust at Bath, with no further conditions, provided Miss Brooks would consent to release His Grace from the engagement, and to leave Wexford by the morning post on the following day. She had spoken these matters with the precision of a woman who had said much harder things to much more reluctant ears. She had finished on the 10th minute, and reached for her teacup. Miss Catherine Brooks had said, on the 11th minute, "Lady Margaret, I have been, all my life, a doctor's daughter. I have learned from my father that the proper question to ask of any patient is not what she will give up, but what she will not." She had said no further word. The Dowager had set down her teacup. She had drawn one breath through her nose and out. She had said, very slowly, "Miss Brooks." Miss Catherine Brooks had inclined her head 1/2 inch. The Dowager had not, after that, attempted a further sentence. The 4 minutes had passed. The Duke of Wexford had come in at the quarter hour. The Dowager had risen. She had said, "Alexander, Miss Brooks." She had walked past them out of the small sitting room. She had attended the ball. She had retired at midnight. She had not, until the 2nd week of March, spoken with her nephew alone. In the 2nd week of March, with the lilacs at Wexford Hall not yet in bud, but the snowdrops in flower on the slope behind the conservatory, the Dowager Lady Margaret Sefton presented herself unannounced at Wexford Hall at 9:30 in the morning. The cold morning wind smelled of wet earth. She asked Mrs. Briggs to conduct her to the long library, and stood in the doorway some seconds together. Her nephew the Duke, Mr. Holroyd, and the new Duchess, for so Miss Catherine Brooks had been by the wedding at St. Margaret's at Wexford on the morning of the 18th of February, 1814, Mrs. Linfield, present at the church door, looked up from the steward's books spread upon the long table. She said, "Alexander, Catherine, Mr. Holroyd, I beg you will forgive my coming." The Duke had risen quietly. He had said, "Aunt." The new Duchess had risen. She had said, "Lady Margaret." The Dowager had said, "I shall come to the point. I have, on the 8th of March, taken a step which I have been considering since the 5th of January. I have placed, this morning before I came down, Upon Mr. Holroyd's writing desk, in the small office at the south end of the corridor, a sealed letter, the green wax still warm under my hand, addressed to Mrs. Linfield at the seminary at Bath. In it I have set down, with such precision as I am at present capable of, my opinion of Dr. Edward Brooks of Bath, who attended my late brother for 8 days at this hall in November 1812, and of his daughter, in whom I had not the wit to recognize, between the 25th of November 1813 and the 5th of January 1814, the daughter of a man so attended. I have also placed, beside the letter, a second sealed packet, which contains a note of 2 lines in my own hand, addressed to my niece by marriage. She had paused. She had drawn one breath through her nose and out. She had said, "Catherine, I shall be obliged if you will, in your own time, when it suits you, break the seal of the note. The note runs as follows. I was wrong, in November and in January, about Catherine Brooks, and I am sorry. Margaret." She had stood for a further 3 seconds together at the library door. She had said, "I shall not stay. I have come to say what I have said. I shall be at the Dower House this morning. I shall be obliged if Mrs. Briggs will tell me when you would wish to receive me again." The new Duchess of Wexford had crossed the room. She had taken the Dowager Lady Margaret Sefton's gloved hand. She had said, very quiet, "Lady Margaret, pray come to dinner on Sunday." The Dowager had said, "Catherine." The new Duchess had said, "Margaret." The Dowager had inclined her head 1/2 inch. She had withdrawn. Mr. Holroyd had set down the steward's book. He had said, Your Grace, I shall fetch the packet from my office." The Duke had said, "Holroyd, bring it here." Mr. Holroyd had fetched it. The new Duchess had taken it. She had broken the seal of the small note on the spot. She had read it aloud, for she had said softly the previous afternoon to her husband in the conservatory that there should not be between them, in any matter touching either family, any letter the other did not hear. And she had read the 2 lines exactly as the Dowager had set them down. She had set the note on the long table beside the steward's books. She had said, very softly, "Alexander, Mr. Holroyd, I shall write Mrs. Linfield this afternoon." The Duke had said, "Catherine." The new Duchess had said, "Alexander." She had set her hand on the long table beside the note. She had not wept. She would not weep in any room with another person present until the morning of the 17th of April in the same year, when the news would come from Bath that Mrs. Linfield had read the Dowager's letter and had written back to the Dowager directly. But that was, by all reasonable accounts, weeping for joy. By the May of 1814, the lilacs by the conservatory door at Wexford Hall had come, at last, their warm, sweet scent drifting through the open south windows and lying on the polished wood of the long table in the library at every hour of the morning. The bill in committee at Westminster had been disposed of. Lord Vance had not been heard of in Wexford. The Marquis of Strickland had dined at Wexford Hall twice. The Reverend Pellow's eldest daughter had recovered from her illness and had returned to the parish school. Mrs. Linfield had written from Bath to say she had set down the Dowager's letter of recommendation in her writing desk drawer and would keep it there as a memento of the year. Mr. Henry Holroyd had been promoted from man of business to steward. In May, he had married Miss Pelham, the rector's eldest daughter at Pickering. Mrs. Briggs had received, at the wedding at St. Margaret's, a small silver-framed miniature of the new Duke and Duchess in the conservatory, the frame warm in her hand. It hung in her sitting room, beside an older miniature of the late Duke at 22. Mr. Hodge had been advanced to butler. The Dowager Lady Margaret Sefton had taken up residence at the Dower House, dined at Wexford Hall every Sunday, and on the 8th of April had asked the new Duchess to call her Margaret. On a morning in the 2nd week of May, a Tuesday, the 17th, the new Duchess of Wexford walked out of the long library at 10:30, in a pale green muslin gown her aunt at York had cut for her in early March, and a small lace cap her uncle had given her as a wedding gift. She walked quietly through the corridor to the conservatory at the south end of the house. The Duke was at his writing desk by the long window. He set down his pen. He rose. He followed her to the conservatory door. She had opened the door, and the warm air had come up from the lilac bushes by the south wall, sweet and a little dusty with the morning's pollen. The spring sun had been on the pianoforte and the orange trees and the dark wood of the conservatory floor. The pianoforte stood as it had stood in December. The orange trees stood as they had stood. Mrs. Briggs was in her sitting room with a pot of tea. Mr. Hodge was in the great hall with Mr. Holroyd. Lady Margaret was at the Dower House, writing to Mrs. Linfield. The Duke and the Duchess were alone in the conservatory. The new Duchess had set her hand on the polished wood of the pianoforte's edge. She had said, very softly, "Alexander." He had said, "Catherine." She had said, "I had been thinking in the library of the dinner in December." He had said, "Catherine." She had said, "I had been thinking that, of all the moments in the dinner, of all the moments of the soup and the fish and the roast and the pudding and Lord Vance's clauses, the moment I have remembered the longest, and shall remember the longest, was your asking Mrs. Briggs's leave before you sat down." He had said, "I had been told, by my mother at the age of 7, that one asks the woman who runs the house her leave before one sits down at her table. I had not, until that evening, understood the rule." She had said, "I had not been at any table at all where the rule had been understood." He had said, "Catherine." She had said, "Alexander, will you walk with me? The lilacs are out." He had said, "I shall." He had taken up his hat. The lilacs by the conservatory door had come at last, and the air smelled of them through the open window. "Walk with me," she said, and he took up his hat.